Welcome to Lecture 3A of German 280. The topic of this lecture is the question of what we see in the past that causes us to believe that something major had changed in European culture around the year 1500. Before 1500, we often talk about the medieval period. Afterwards, we start talking about the early modern period or the Renaissance. And 1500, of course, is just a ballpark date. Really, we're talking about a set of changes in society that are beginning to really push around 1400 and that keep on changing until 1600. We'll see over the course of the next few lectures what these things are. In this particular lecture, I want to focus on one of the major new inventions, one of the major new pieces of technology that gets invented in the 15th century, in the 1430s, that spreads really quickly and that transforms life all over Europe, that transforms information, reading, and books all over Europe. And that is, of course, the printing press. Before I get right into the printing press and the kinds of changes that it occasioned and the kind of knock-on effect that we think of as the Renaissance, this revival of learning and humanism that is the Renaissance, I want to talk just briefly, just a minute or two, about what writing looked like, what literature looked like, what high culture stories passed from person to person, what that looked like before we had the printed book that we're so familiar with. We haven't really talked much about the culture of the Middle Ages. We've talked about the societal structure. We've talked about the rise of the Hanseatic League. We've talked about major phenomena like the Black Death. We've talked about figures like Barbarossa, and we've talked about crusades and pilgrimages and so on. Well, it's important to understand that the medieval period is considered the first great period of flourishing literature in the German language, in Middle High German, as in the history of the German language. That's what we call the kind of German written and spoken in that era. In fact, looking back on it, the 1200s especially are seen as a kind of golden age of literature in German. And that's because the Hohenstaufen emperors were great. These are the emperors like Barbarossa, who were heading up the Holy Roman Empire, were German speakers who were great supporters of the arts. And they had a very wealthy court, and they could support a lot of Minnesänger, these troubadours and storytellers who would come to court to entertain the very powerful and the very wealthy. And because Germany wasn't united, because there were lots of little principalities and kingdoms and things all over the place, then you've got a whole lot of competing courts and a whole lot of wealthy people who want the best entertainment in their neck of the woods. And so we get an enormous flourishing of song, of poetry, of music, and of storytelling. So the kind of literature that we talk about during this period, we kind of put it under the label courtly literature, not just because it's the literature about life at court, about knights and so on, ladies and so on, but it's also the literature for the court, right? So the courts are patronizing these writers and these storytellers, and some people are beginning to write down the stories that are being told orally, right? So that's the important thing. This is why I'm talking about this in the connection with the printing press, that we think of books and we think of things that are printed or that we read digitally even. There's a period of time where if something is written down, it has to be done by hand. It's a very elite group of people who can even read or write. And books, the kind of collecting of stories bound between bookends, that's only for the super wealthy, right? However, we do have a lot of records from this period where people did write down the stories that were being told by these epic poets, these poets who told epic stories. And they are mostly the adventures of knights. Believe it or not, in German we have loads of versions of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. We think of that as a British king, but actually that tradition comes through France into the German-speaking world, and the most popular literature and stories of the era are stories about King Arthur and his knights. There's also the great tradition of Minnesang. Minne means love, and so there are lots of singers and poets writing about love in this grand sort of courtly style, love for the lady of the court. So it's an oral tradition and it's a handwritten tradition. So in the long version of this course, we often read a section of a story told by Wolfram von Eschenbach, who was a great German writer of the medieval period. And he wrote many things, but most famously he wrote something called Parsifal around the year 1210. Again, it's not a book. It's not got a launch date. It isn't published by a publisher. This is just a guy who's telling his version of the story. And various people begin to write it down, right? So we have scraps of manuscript that record how Wolfram von Eschenbach told the story of this Knight of the Round Table, this king of the Holy Grail, or seeker after the Holy Grail, Parsifal. And this is an image that I just want to draw your attention to, because this guy is a poet, right? Look at him. He's dressed like a knight. He is a knight. He's got a coat of arms. He's got, a horse wearing his coat of arms too. He's got an equerry who's taking care, a squire who's taking care of his horse. So it was very normal at the medieval courts that the poet was also a hunter. The poet was also someone who participated in the jousts. The poet was also a crusader. The poet was also a knight, right? And the stories were about knights. Last thing before we get going on the radical change that's introduced by the printing press. This is what writing looked like before the printing press. This is handwritten. It's kind of beautifully written, but it's written by hand with some decoration on the capital letters. You can see some red ink on the capital letters, and these are just some lines from Wolfram's Parsifal. And on the right here is a transcription, and you can see, I'm not great at Middle High German, but Durch Minne, du an ihm erstarb. It doesn't look like modern German because Middle High German is related to modern German. It's the ancestor of modern German, but it's very different. It's only when Luther begins to translate the Bible a couple of hundred years after Wolfram writes these words that we begin to see a kind of standardization of German that looks a little bit like our version of German in the modern day. This looks a little bit more like Dutch. But that's what books looked like that, sometimes with illustrations, as we see here, before the occurrence of the printing press. And even during the period when the printing press is emerging and it's a technology that's beginning to spread all over Europe, there's still a period of about 60, 70 years where people are still publishing, not publishing, but writing books by hand, until really around the year 1500, when the printing press really is sort of master of all book publishing. Okay, so now we're kind of to the meat of today's lecture, which is my question of what is it that makes the Middle Ages different from the modern era and vice versa. Something changes that makes us modern, and it seems to happen around the year 1500. And you can say, give or take 100 years, this phase, this transition is happening that makes the world look really, really different from 1400 to 1600 in a way that it didn't look really, really different from 1200 to 1400, if you understand what I mean. So there are many things that go into this. For example, you could say the invention of the printing press changes everything. That happens around 1436, and by the time it really has taken off, by the end of the century, by the year 1500, now more and more people have access to knowledge, and more people have a way of publishing their ideas, and more people have a way of printing ideas. So there's a democratization of knowledge that goes on that changes everything forever. And so what's being printed? What's being printed are new ideas, new revolutions in science, new ideas about religion and reforming the church, and so on and so forth. So the printing press brings with it this wave of new ideas into Europe. And some of those ideas are being brought by people who have left Constantinople. So the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, you'll recall, back in the year 500 or so, around Constantinople. Constantinople is conquered by the Ottomans in 1453, so a lot of refugees come into Europe through Venice and then making their way into other parts of Europe. And a lot of these people are scholars who are bringing with them all of the knowledge that's been developing in the Arab world for the previous decades, including things like ancient Greek texts that had been lost to Europe, but had been saved in other parts of the world. They come back, they make their way back into Europe with this kind of flow of refugees leaving Constantinople, leaving Byzantium, as that becomes Ottoman, eventually Turkish. So that happens in 1453. So these are two grand coincidences, right, that we're seeing lots of new ideas, lots of ancient texts coming back to Europe, Aristotle and so on, coming back into Europe at a time when suddenly people can actually, they have the technology to print them and to share them with each other. Another kind of watershed moment will be the discovery of the New World, the kind of a high point in the age of exploration of 1492. And I think this is really important, even though 1492 is a kind of deceptive date. It sounds like nothing was discovered beforehand, and as I told you last time, there has been an age of discovery and exploration going on for the previous 200 years. And in fact, we know that the Vikings were in North America before Columbus. But at the same time, this is a really dramatic and extraordinary event because especially the Spanish crown, also the Portuguese crown, benefit enormously from what happens when they, quote unquote, discover the quote unquote New World. I'm sure you've taken other courses where you've thought about the impact of that. But that brings also all kinds of new ideas, and it also brings a flood of wealth into Europe. So there's now money for the printing of these ideas and so on and so forth. So that all happens in the 15th century. And then finally, we might look at something like the Reformation, which is made possible in some ways by the things that are listed above it, especially by the invention of the printing press. There had been reformers before 1517, before Luther, but nobody had been so clever and canny as to write down their ideas in very funny, sometimes, always well-argued pamphlets, and use this cheap new way of distributing them to get them all over Europe. And so there's a way in which Luther, it comes at the right time. It's not just that Luther is the right person or has the ideas that are going to work and be picked up by other people in terms of trying to reform the Catholic Church. It's that he's got the technology and the distribution possibilities at hand that other people before him didn't have. Okay, so thinking of the printing press then as something that is combined with these and other things to bring us into the modern era. Let's think just briefly about how books were produced in the Middle Ages. Before the printing press, we had monks, usually monks because they were an educated elite, copying written texts by hand. They were mainly religious texts, very often in Latin, occasionally pedagogical texts or advice books, but mostly Latin religious texts or commentaries on the Bible. This is a scriptorium. This would have been a typical thing you'd find at a monastery, where we've got people, monks, who day in, day out see it as their kind of religious duty to copy out the Bible or prayer books and so on. This is a text from back then. This is a page from Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach, one of the surviving scraps of Parsifal. And you can see how it is. One of the things that's meant that it has survived is that it's not on paper, it's on vellum, it's on animal skin. But if you think of the process that goes into making ink and the process that goes into making vellum and how valuable these things are, you can see that's yet another reason why books were elite objects only for the very wealthy in the medieval period. This is an example of the most elite, the most kind of wealthy book that could be produced. It's beautifully bound with clasps that are probably at least gilt. And the pages themselves are decorated stunningly with gold leaf and so on. And this is a medieval Book of Days. A Book of Days was a prayer book where a king maybe, or a queen, or a very wealthy man or woman would have a prayer a day over the course of the year and make their way through their prayer book. So this kind of psalter is also something that would have been a typically decorated thing that someone might have in the Middle Ages. So then along comes Gutenberg, and he's not the only person who's thinking about using this kind of technology, but he's the one we remember. Johannes Gutenberg, born in 1400, died 1468, invents the printing press. He takes a wine press. I mean, the press technology has been around for a long time: cider presses, olive presses, wine presses. He takes it and he adapts it slightly so that it will allow him to press blocks of type that have been set into sentences and lines, maybe sometimes with woodcuts for images, and to efficiently ink that up and press it on paper using a combination of technology and just brute force, because it involves a lot of pressing. But the really genius thing is that, and in this image we see it because he seems to have a kind of tweezers in his hand, and he's got something else in his other hand that has letters in it. And that's because what he actually invented was movable type. So rather than chiseling out an entire sentence on a block of wood, instead he created letters that could easily be put into any order and then printed and then taken back out again and put into another order, so that you have movable type. That's the real innovation of Gutenberg. Gutenberg's printing revolution is so important that that's the technology, right? And here, this is like a romantic notion of what that might look like, but it does take a lot of energy to make these things work. And so Gutenberg's innovation is considered to have been so important that when Time magazine was figuring out who was the person of the millennium, not just the person of the year, in the year 1999, they were saying, let's figure out who the person was who had the biggest influence on the previous 1,000 years. They didn't pick Martin Luther, who created the Protestant Reformation, and they didn't pick any of the leaders of the 20th century, or the people, let's say, the people who invented the atomic bomb or something. They didn't pick any of these people whose impact was so extraordinary on the world. They picked Gutenberg. They said what Gutenberg did, what he introduced, changed the world in a way that has never been seen since. I'd say he changed it in a way that has been seen since, and what has been the modern revolution of our era, of our lifetimes, has been the digital revolution. So the equivalent thing is happening with the development of the internet and people's ability to use digital technology. So that's just as insane a revolution as what Gutenberg did. This is a page from a Gutenberg Bible. The Gutenberg Bible is in Latin. It's not in English or German. It's in Latin because you weren't allowed to have anything but a Latin version of the Bible. The Catholic Church at the time, which is the only church there was at the time in Europe, that church frowned on the Bible being printed in any other language but Latin. They wanted to keep interpretation of the Bible in the hands of, in their own hands, in the hands of priests and bishops and the Pope. This is a Gutenberg Bible that I took a photograph of when I was at the Huntington Library in California. But you can see Gutenberg Bibles. There's a handful of them left on display. You can see one in Washington, D.C. and places like that. Okay, so his invention brings about the mass circulation of books. Within 50 years of the invention, 30,000 different titles, different books have been produced. 12 million copies of those 30,000 different books have come out. That's a huge, staggering amount of books. We call books printed before 1500 incunables because they're printed books, but they're also being treated like fancy books too for a long time, because people have to get out of the mindset of books being such a precious object. So you can see that even though it's a printed book, he's trying to make it look like a medieval manuscript. So they've gone out of their way to try and still make it look like a fancy manuscript. So these early printed books look a lot like the handwritten books that went before, and it's only around the 1490s, 1500 that people begin to make books that look a little bit more modern to us. Also, before 1500, 75% of all books were in Latin, and after 1500, 75% of all books were not in Latin. They were in the vernacular, that is, the language of the country where they were being read. So it's not like 1436 comes around and the next day everybody's using the printing press. Not at all. After, if we just take the example of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, for example, after 1436, 80 more handwritten copies of Parsifal were handwritten, and 6 of them were illustrated. This is an example from it. So it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of the next 50, 60 years, his invention led to a spread of knowledge. It substituted the oral tradition. It took oral literature and put it into writing and distributed it in a way that spread these ideas all over Europe. And it led to what we often call the democratization of knowledge. That is the end of an elitist handwritten tradition. We see more regional literature making it out into the world, and most importantly for us, it also leads to an expansion of Reformation writings, so Luther's writings, translations, and pamphlets. We don't have a successful Protestant Reformation if we don't have the Gutenberg invention. And then also artists begin to produce in a way that can be reproduced easily in these books. So someone like Albert Dürer becomes more famous than artists might have been before him because they've got this access to this new technology and this new way of distributing words. Which brings us to the Renaissance, which is the period often called the early modern period, and it's the period that followed the late Middle Ages and comes before the Baroque period. So the Baroque period follows the Renaissance, and the late medieval period precedes the Renaissance. If we wanted to give it a date range, we would say probably 1450 to 1600, although we could debate about that. This is the period that, so early modernists, this is the period that they work in. The Renaissance is a word that is French, and it means the rebirth. So you're saying, why are we calling this period the rebirth? And I referred to it in a couple of lectures ago, and that is that it was often seen as the moment when the aesthetic value of Greek antiquity and Roman antiquity was reborn. That is, there's a period when the influence of Rome and the influence of Greek thought and philosophy is lost in Europe. And it comes back into Europe partly because of all of these fleeing scholars, but it comes back into Europe and is spread about Europe because of the printing press, and it changes everything. And so it's a rebirth of these ancient ideas and of modern ideas too. There was a scholar in 1860, a Swiss scholar named Jakob Burckhardt, who wrote a very famous book about the Renaissance. And he did a summary of the Renaissance that he said, look, it was the period where we rediscovered the world and we rediscovered man. What did he mean by that? I think it's handy, even if it's an old phrase. I think it's a handy way of thinking about what's happening during the 16th century, during the 1500s, during the Renaissance. The discovery of the world refers to the fact that it's a period when the natural sciences also become very important. It's with the beginning of this movement away from just faith and people looking at the world and interpreting it through their religious perspective, and starting to look at the world through what was called natural philosophy at the time, that is science. So we're seeing the rise of science and people who spend their time either taking a telescope and looking at the heavens and describing astronomy in a way that it is describing the movement of the planets in a way it hadn't been described before, rather than taking on faith that there's a shape to the planets and it's explained in religious texts or something like that. So the discovery of the world, and we could say that the discovery of man, part of his phrase, refers to the fact that the Renaissance is often seen as the period when individuals come into their own. That is, there's an individualism that arises in the Renaissance that is a key hallmark of the modern world, of the world you and I live in. And if we want to trace back the roots of modern individualism, we don't go back to the medieval period, where people felt like they had a place in the hierarchy and they accepted that place in the hierarchy. It's a bit overgeneralization, but you get the idea. We go back to the Renaissance and we suddenly see individuals becoming more important than, let's say, the group. We see science applied to art during the Renaissance in a way that's also revolutionary. So people often point to the discovery of perspective as a technique in painting, and that's a phenomenon of the Renaissance. You can see here some diagrams that show you what perspective, what the principles of perspective are for someone who is trying to create a work of art. But we see it here in a really super example by Raphael, one of the great Renaissance painters. This is a fresco that he painted around 1509 to 1511 called The School of Athens. And so here we see a number of things coming together that are considered hallmarks of the Renaissance. First of all, an interest in Greek philosophy and in Greek culture, the revival of antiquity that is the Renaissance, because that's what's going on here. We have all of these different Renaissance thinkers in the School of Athens. And also the discovery of perspective. So the perspective is beautifully shown in this image. We see instead of a flat surface, it looks three-dimensional. It looks three-dimensional because he's used this visual trick of making things that are further away look small and things that are closer to us look big. And so all of these lines converge on a vanishing point in the distance, and that's the trick that brings the eye into this image and that makes it look deep and more realistic. So we see, because of perspective and because of this discovery of the world and man, in other words, an interest in how the human body really works and what people really look like, and trying to put that into works of art too. These are all of the things that make Renaissance art revolutionary. You'll have seen this before. This is Vitruvian Man, an image, a kind of geometrically perfect image that marries mathematics and the male body, kind of an accurate representation of the male body. It's a work by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's also a kind of, we could call it an emblematic work for Renaissance art. That's just a close-up of the hand of Michelangelo's David, and look at how accurate he's trying to be with all of the veins and the size. The hand is oversized because the statue was supposed to be on top of a building and seen from a distance, but the veins themselves, the detail in what the hand looks like exactly, this is the science of the Renaissance coming through in the art. It's a period when portrait painting takes on a role that it never had before. So you and I presume that because we take selfies or we take photographs of our friends all the time, this is it's second nature to us that we have images of other people that are recognizable. But portrait painting, I mean, this is centuries before we have photography. Portrait painting, that is the painting of individuals for their own sake, so that we can have a copy of them and remember what they looked like because they were our son or our lover or parent or something like that. This happens in the Renaissance. So this is a painting from 1481. And this is a realistic painting of this young man. Who are just some other examples here. This happens to be a painting of the Renaissance writer Machiavelli, and I'm not going to talk about his the political writings, the extraordinary political writings that he was famous for during the Renaissance. But the fact that we have a portrait of him and we know what he looked like, this is a new thing. It's in the Renaissance that we begin to understand what people. We could begin to be able to look back and say, oh, that's what he really looked like. We don't really know what Charlemagne looked like. We don't know what Barbarossa looked like. A, because people weren't interested in capturing the image for some reason of an individual while they were alive for posterity, and B, because they didn't have the techniques. They had lost those techniques that the Greeks had developed and the Romans had copied of creating realistic works of art, and it's only in the Renaissance that these things come back into being. And here we have the rise of individualism too, right? So here we have this famous individual and a portrait of him, and we know what he looked like. Ditto for Michelangelo. Michelangelo, one of the most famous artists of the Renaissance. This is someone who is painting his own portrait as an older man here. And when I say he's not an artisan, what I'm saying is that there's also a revolution in art that means that the artist is no longer hidden from the viewer. So for most of medieval art, nobody's signing anything. We don't know who made things because it wasn't considered something that was worth, that people, it's not that they didn't value the art, but the cult of the artist hadn't happened yet. And so the artist as an individual hadn't happened yet. The artist was seen as a kind of someone who had learned a trade. And that changes in the Renaissance. The artist can become a genius. The artist can become someone who really stands out. And Michelangelo is an example of that. But then also people who are not famous to you and me anymore still had their portraits painted. Wealthy people. This is the astronomer Nicholas Kratzer by a famous German painter, Hans Holbein. And this is now at the Louvre, this very famous, not very famous painting. But I'm showing it to you in order to show you that there's a plethora of art out there that is the art of individuals, realistic depictions of individuals with real faces made during the Renaissance. And it's typical of the rise of the individual during the Renaissance. So my last point on this is that I want to bring the Renaissance home to the German-speaking world. I also kind of did it here, talking about Hans Holbein. But the even more famous Northern Renaissance artist is Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was born in 1471 and died in 1528, so he spans that magic year of 1500 that is often seen as the start of the modern era. And here we see, again, a realistic self-portrait. One of many, if you're ever in the Prado in Spain, you can go and actually see it. It's not a very big painting, it's a very beautiful painting. And all his life, he consistently went back and painted himself, just like Michelangelo did. This doesn't happen before 1500. People don't do that before 1500, and they start to do it in this period where a famous artist can be a thing. He was born in Nuremberg. He was the son of a goldsmith and was expected to apprentice as a goldsmith, but instead apprenticed as a painter. He had his journeyman years. That is a typical part of an apprenticeship where you leave home and you see what people are doing in your field in other areas. He did in the 1490s. He did that, and he went around German-speaking and Swiss parts of Europe, but he also went to Italy. He went to Venice, and it's in Venice that he began to see some of the new trends and bring them back up to the workshop that he founded in Nuremberg. A famous set of, he was famous for woodcuts as well as for paintings. This is one of his early sets of woodcuts on the Apocalypse. Here we have the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse. But in 1505 he went back to Italy and he started working again on perspective. He learnt a lot about how to bring, so we can see there's still a slight two-dimensionality. It's still slightly flat, his 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse. And he gets better at perspective on visiting Italy again. So let's look at one of his images that is very famous and that it shows that perspective, doing better at perspective. This is a very symbolic painting. It's called Ritter, Tod und Teufel, the Knight, the Death, and the Devil. You can see he painted it in 1513, Anno Domini, AD. Albrecht Dürer happens to have the right initials for the year of our Lord, right? So that's the year that he did this woodcut. And it was part of a set of woodcuts where he was trying to portray the different ways a person can have a good life. What are the ways we can live a good life? And one of them is the active life. And so this is the life of the knight who, even though he sees, his time passing by, and this is death reminding him that he's only got a short amount of time on earth, and that in fact he should have his ideas about the city of God. It should be heaven that he's headed towards. He still rides on. He shows all of those wonderful traits of the medieval knight. That is, he's steadfast and he keeps on going through all of the dark night and ignores evil. And the devil also is trying to tempt him over here, and this ferocious beast is supposed to be the devil, and he's ignoring them. He's got his loyal dog coming along with him. Note the accuracy, the kind of perfect physiognomy that we see on the horse. That's a typical development of the Renaissance, that we're seeing not just realism in faces that may look real to us in the way the armor is fitting on his body that may look more realistic, but also where the muscles of a horse's leg might be. So a kind of care, people being careful, artists being careful to try and show the natural world as it is. Those are the close-ups from that image. So it's showing the active life, the other woodcuts in this series. This is Saint Jerome, and it shows how a good life can also be the life of contemplation. This Saint Jerome famously translated the various bits of the Bible that existed into a Latin, the Vulgate as it's called, into a Latin version, which became then the standard version of the Bible for centuries. And he also has time passing with this symbol of an egg timer here, the Sanduhr, as the Germans call it. And he also has his loyal dog who's kind of waiting at his feet. So this is the good life that is lived by a saint. And finally, you can have a good life. That's the life of the intellectual, the life of the scientific questioning mind. It is a life that brings with it melancholy because of all of the unanswered questions that an individual might have. Someday you should sit down and just look at this image and see how extraordinarily rich in detail it is, how this is called a magic square. Anybody who's interested in maths will look that up and find out why this is considered a magic square. But he's got the symbols of geometry all around him, an angelic kind of figure who's trying to live the life of science, the life of the mind, the life that puts things in the balance and measures them and tries to understand them that way. An extraordinary image. He did his self-portraits too. That's not a self-portrait, I'm just kidding. And I'm going to end with this, which is his self-portrait in my fur coat. It was done in the year 1500. And I like this image because it's almost an iconic image for all that's going on at the time. That we're living in the year 1500. We hit a year where the medieval is merging into the early modern, and one of those changes is that individuals are coming to the fore, and instead of the kind of communal religious ideal of the medieval era, we begin to have kind of an individualistic element coming into being. I'm not saying that particularly about Dürer himself. I'm just saying that this image seems emblematic of so many changes. Dürer himself was a man of great faith, a supporter of the Protestant Reformation, actually, and a very deeply religious Christian, as you can see from the imagery of his other works. But here he's putting himself almost into the pose of a Christ-like figure, right? Because the finger pointing upwards is very typical of certain images that we see of Christ. That's kind of pointing towards the heart or pointing towards heaven. And he's also he's got the hair and the beard that becomes typical of representations of Jesus around this time. So my self-portrait in a fur coat brings us out of, or kind of reminds us that this is a period of transition, right? That we still have people who are people of sort of deep religious faith, but we're also seeing the rise of this individualist moment and the rise of the artist as a famous individual whose own image is worth capturing. So he's looking into himself almost in this image, and he's not Albrecht Dürer anymore. He's every man. Somehow he's every man on earth in this image. So here's my takeaway on the rise of print culture and the Renaissance, and you can read that at your leisure. This is a summary of the main points I was trying to make, and it's maybe helpful to kind of, as you digest this lecture, which was a little bit long.